Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version, our other shows, and some lovely soothing merch to make your days and nights sweeter. Oh man, I am excited. When I started my bedtime story podcast, I felt like it should have started in the autumn, the coziest season. But fate had plans for April instead. When we brought this show out, again, I thought we'd launch in the fall. And we even had a bunch of episodes ready to go, but technical difficulties set us back, and we pushed our start date to December. Now, finally, I get to spin you soothing autumnal stories, and I am so happy about it. I find there is a lot to love about all the seasons, but fall? Come on. That is elite coziness. And today the village is just putting a toe in the cooler waters of the coming season, lingering at the tail end of summer and looking forward to all that the burr months will bring. As usual, if you stick around after the story, I'll be there to spill some village tea, as it were, and tell you some behind-the-scenes particulars. Now, just because I have a feeling it will feel good, let's take a deep breath in through the nose and sigh from your mouth. One more. Bring it in and let it go. Good. Our stories today start in the garden as we harvest a few tomatoes on our way to take the washing down from the line in the last warm days. Then we'll shake off a stale mood and find a few small ways to practice joy in a change of scenery. Finally, we'll roll up the cuffs on our pants and step into the sand just as the sun is setting on the lake in Bonfire. The last warm days. Everything was in bloom. The grass was thick underfoot, and the gardens were full of long-necked flowers, ripe vegetables, and buzzing, floating bugs. I'd spent the day lazily wandering from a sunny spot at the edge of the water to the quiet of the kitchen, where I'd paged through a stack of cookbooks, folding over the corners of recipes I might make one day, and the clean, sweet smell of the laundry line out back, where white sheets and pillowcases were pegged up and slowly shifting in the breeze. Nothing had to be done today, which meant that taking on little chores at my own pace was happy work. So this morning, I'd started in the kitchen, setting it to rights, clearing the counters and wiping them down till everything felt fresh and clean. Then I lit a candle and slid it into the center of the kitchen table. Every time I walked back through the room, I could smell it, herby and bright like lavender and green tea. I stepped back outside and to an old quilt spread out under a few tall trees. It was cool and shady, and I flopped down and laid back with my hands tucked behind my head. I stretched my legs out long and crossed one ankle over the other, looking up at the sunlight shifting and flitting through the layers of leaves. A bird caught my eye, and I watched it glide from one branch to another. It hopped and turned and called out, then took off again. I turned over onto my side and propped my head in my hand and noticed a ladybug climbing a blade of grass at the edge of my blanket. I reached out and offered her my hand. She seemed to think about it for a moment, then scuttled on, and I watched her crawl across my thumbnail and over the ridge of a knuckle before spreading her shiny spotted wings and flying away. I hummed to myself a bit, looking out past the back of the house where the corner of the clothesline ran to an old hook that had, a few generations ago, been screwed straight into a tree. I pushed back up to my feet and clapped my hands together to dust them off. Those sheets were probably dry by now. But on my way back to the laundry line, I got distracted by the garden. I'd been in the plants already a few times today, cutting some echinacea and daisies for the table and picking raspberries for breakfast and a few cucumbers for a sandwich at lunch. But I never really got tired of walking through the rows and checking on everyone. I had rows of lettuce that had been picked and replanted twice already this summer, hardy kale and cabbage that would last into the fall, snow peas and chard, a few promising pumpkins, enough butternut squashes to last me through the winter, carrots, cucumbers, and zucchini, and an absolute wealth of tomato plants. The tomatoes were my favorite. I grew lots of varieties and had enough for canning and freezing and drying, and plenty for summer eating. I ran my hand over the fuzzy green leaf of a plant and smelled that heady, viney tang that is the smell of summer. I pulled the leaf up to my face and breathed it in, then rubbed it across my neck and wrists. It was the best summer perfume. I stood in the dusty, soft earth and picked tiny, ripe cherry tomatoes from the vines, letting them burst between my teeth, sweet and bright and delicious. I picked a few large slicing tomatoes, perfect with just a little sea salt and black pepper, then some heart-shaped pink tomatoes, good for sauces and salads. Soon I was folding up the edge of my shirt to catch my harvest. I kept an old ceramic bowl at the back steps for such impromptu picking and carefully set down my catch. I rinsed off my hands at the spigot and let them dry in the air while I walked out to the line. The afternoon sun was slanting through the trees, and in the air I could smell a bit of the lavender soap I'd washed the sheets in. They were dry, and I slowly shook them out and folded them and laid them in my wicker basket. They were my last load for the day, so I carried the basket to the back door, fetching up the bowl of tomatoes on my way in. I set the tomatoes in the sink and carried the basket through to the linen closet. The windows were open in every room of the house, and even on a warm day, the breeze kept the rooms cool and comfortable. I looked down the hall to the open door of my bedroom. I'd done my own bed first that day, so my room was tidy and the bed freshly made up. I slipped down the hall and into my room and took a deep breath of the afternoon air coming in through the windows. The bed was like a magnet, irresistibly pulling me over to rest my cheek against the sun-dried coverlet. I sprawled my limbs and took up as much space as I liked. As my eyes closed, my mind flipped back through the pages of the day, and I thought of my recipe books, of the candy shell wings of the ladybug, the cool water from the backyard spigot on my wrists, the sheets folded in their basket, and the twisted roots of my carrots tucked into the garden soil. Summer was nearly over. In a few weeks, the nights would come sooner and cooler. The leaves would dry and turn. But for now, there was still time to linger on a warm day and enjoy. A change of scenery. It was that end part of the summer when the heat gets a bit tedious. I'd been a little grouchy all day, tired of my clothes sticking to my back. I'd tried sitting on my front stoop, hoping to catch a little breeze, but instead I only noticed the heat rising in ripples off the sidewalks and the pervasive song of the cicadas. There was nothing in the fridge that I wanted for dinner. The overhead fan in the living room didn't seem to turn fast enough to cool anything down, and overall I was fussy and fed up. I leaned against the counter, my arms crossed in front of me, and eventually had to laugh at the grown-up, low-key tantrum I was throwing. It reminded me, actually, of feeling this way as a child, of being overhot and overtired, and at best, pouting about it. And that gave me an idea. My parents, when us kids had reached the point of maximum fuss on a hot summer day, had made the genius move of changing the subject. We'd be handed a fudgesicle, shuffled into the car, and off we'd speed with the windows down. As the car filled with wind and we had something sweet to enjoy, we'd cool off in every sense. We might drive through the country, pointing out cows in a field or marveling at how high the corn was. Other days we might just ride the highway for a while. No destination in mind. It was just the change of scenery that shook us out of our moods. I needed to shake myself up a bit today. Do something out of the ordinary to break myself out of this little bit of late summer funk. I didn't know where I was going, but I had a feeling it had to start with just leaving the house. I even checked the freezer and found a single watermelon juice pop to take with me. It had worked for me when I was a kid, so why not? Soon I was driving through the neighborhood streets, my popsicle in hand. Popsicles are underrated, I think. Cold, sweet, feels special, but cost peanuts. And watermelon? That's like the best summer flavor ever. Already, I was cheering up. I turned a corner and started to drive out of town. I tried keeping my windows down, as they'd been in my memory, but I had a feeling the only reason my folks had done that was because our old car hadn't had AC. It felt like such a relief as the cool air swirled around me. I turned on some music and sang along. I drove out past the orchards and open fields. The heat was different out here. In the city, it felt stuck and thick. But out here, even though the sun was still beating down, the air could move. And in the distance, I could see the tops of trees shifting slowly in a breeze I still couldn't detect, but was comforted was there. I kept driving, my popsicle reduced to just a pink stick, and the music going in and out as I got farther from the radio signal. Eventually I turned it off and did roll down the windows, letting the rushing air wash over me. I was beginning to feel refreshed. I saw people sitting on front porches, kids in their yards playing with hoses, splashing in baby pools in the shade. I found myself smiling at them, wanting to wave at the people on bikes. This happens to me sometimes, on walks or when I'm sitting in a cafe. I see people just doing normal people things, feeding the ducks by the lake, taking the first sip of their favorite drink, staring off into space from a park bench. And suddenly my heart beats for them. I choke up. I am so glad they are there. I fall in love a little, and I'm betting I'm not the only one who feels this way. And I'm pretty sure that means most days, someone out there is wishing you well, cheering you on, even if you never see it. I saw a sign for a town I'd driven by, but never stopped into before, and made a quick turn toward it. I imagined my own town was much the same, but just seeing different houses, different mailboxes and yards felt intriguing. I wound through the neighborhoods and closer to their downtown. The sign in front of their elementary school had a countdown to the first day of classes, and their library had a huge garden out front, flowers and paths and shady spots to stop and read. Their town was a bit bigger than ours, and after a minute, I decided to just park on a random street and get out to window shop and see what this little place was about. I dropped my popsicle stick in a trash can and slid my hands into my pockets and strolled past a few shops. I found a busy coffee shop with a dozen tables set out on sidewalks. There was a table full of teenagers drinking iced coffees and talking, one with a cast on his arm that his friends were drawing on with bright markers. On the next corner, there was a little shop whose window was full of houseplants and pretty pots, and I stopped in to wander through their displays. Shiny shears and garden tools were laid out on a table beside the door, and inside it smelled of library dust and eucalyptus. There were counters full of different kinds of plants, giant monsteras and tiny succulents, flowering cacti and simple climbing pothos. Why, when you see a cactus plant clearly covered with spines, do you want to reach out and touch it. I was restraining myself from just that as the shopkeeper walked by with a watering can in his hand. He paused, giving a ponytail palm a drink, and whispered, "They really are sharp." I laughed at him, reading my mind, and tucked my hands back into my pockets. On the next street, I began to smell popcorn. Not just any popcorn, movie popcorn. The air was still hot and the sun bright, and I thought of how good it would feel to sit in a cool theater for a couple of hours, be entertained, and snack on something delicious. I turned toward the scent of the popcorn and found a theater with a big marquee and patrons with the same idea as me streaming in. There was a show starting in just a few minutes, and I bought a ticket and a lemonade and, of course, some popcorn. Inside the dark theater, I sighed as the air cooled me down. There were buttons on my chair, and as I pushed them, the seat reclined and a leg rest came up. I laughed to myself at my own joy in that moment. I'd done it. I'd shaken off the grouchy mood. I was refreshed and incredibly comfortable. And by the time the show let out, the sun would be down and the evening air would be cool and sweet. Bonfire. The days were just starting to get a bit shorter. I'd noticed it first in the mornings, shuffling into the kitchen to set the kettle on the stove and finding the dusky darkness still flooding the yard. Through the window, I'd heard the first movements of chipmunks and birds after a summer of them being up well ahead of me by this hour of the morning. Dark mornings always remind me of the first days back to school in the fall as a child. In those years, summer days ran together, and weeks might go by without me knowing what day it was. Bike rides, beach days, the summer fair in the park, sleeping late and staying awake for fireworks and fireflies. They all blended together like drawings in a flip book. But when the sun got up later, and the mornings were dark and cool, it meant it was time for new shoes and pencil cases and paper sack lunches made the night before, with notes tucked in for reading at the cafeteria table. Along with the dim mornings, the nights were coming a bit sooner, and a few trees, just a few, up in the highest branches, were drying and changing. Did you know trees change from their tops down? As their growth cycle slows, their crowns, being furthest from the roots, are the first to show the shift. So here we were, darker mornings, earlier nights, and changing leaves. Autumn was beginning. And so it was the perfect time for one of the last bonfires of the year. The day had had flashes of heat, when the clouds cleared and the sun beat down, but between those bursts the air was cool, and as I circled through the sandy lot at the edge of the beach, I was glad I'd brought a sweater. I pulled it over my head as I stepped out of the car, and thought it might be the first time in a few months that I'd worn anything but t-shirts and tank tops. I pushed my keys into my back pocket, rolled the cuffs of my jeans up a bit, and stepped barefoot into the sand. It was cool on the surface, but as my feet sank deeper in, I found pockets of warmth left from the day. We had planned to meet up around sunset, but I'd come a bit early just to walk the beach and watch the sky change. There were still a few folks sitting out on beach towels, determined to get the very last bit of summer sun into their systems, though they'd resorted to wrapping spare towels around their shoulders and sat close together, their sandy knees touching. I watched a couple kids, clearly unconcerned with the cooling evening air, as they ran back into the waves, shouting and laughing. A younger brother toddled behind them, carrying a pail with a big round sun painted on its side. And he stopped at the edge of the water and pushed handfuls of wet sand into it. He dragged it back up the beach to his family's blanket, where he tipped it out onto his mother's already buried feet, clapping his small hand against the bottom of the pail to empty it. His mother patiently let him mound up the sand and pat it smooth. And when he sat back to look at his work and started to giggle, she laughed with him. Farther down the beach, I followed a zigzag of paw prints from the many dogs that had walked it that day. Some were tiny, Chihuahuas and Yorkies, I guessed, and some were huge and trailed down to the water and back again and again. I could imagine a retriever watching a stick spinning end over end as it was tossed out into the water, and the thudding paws racing into the waves to fetch it back. The lowering sun was making me squint, and I turned away from it to look back down the shore. On long strings that sometimes disappeared in the evening air, I saw a fleet of floating, flying objects. A dragon with a long tail as red as the setting sun. A diamond-shaped clownfish with white stripes edged in black. And a rainbow-patterned box turning and fluttering in the wind. I hadn't flown a kite since I was in grade school, and as I watched, I wondered why. It seemed an excellent way to spend a bit of time. I stood a while, my toes in the sand and my head tilted back to watch them. Down on the ground, the breeze was slight, but higher up, there must have been a good bit of wind, and it seemed stronger the higher they rose. I was lost in the watching for a while, then heard my name called out and turned back in the direction I had come. I saw an arm waving in the distance and the glowing spark of a just-begun fire. I waved back, cupped my hand around my mouth, and called out a greeting. The bonfire was beginning. I pushed my feet through the sand step by step, and by the time I made it to the circle of logs and camp chairs, the fire had caught and the wood was crackling. I caught my friends in long hugs. Their bodies were warm from the fire, but their cheeks cool from the evening air. We turned to watch the sunset as we chatted and caught up. It slid down the horizon, the surface of the water turning red and orange with the reflection. We'd seen it 1,000 times and would hopefully see it 1,000 more. But still, there was something special about the moment when the sun slipped completely out of sight. We held our breath. We called out, "Here it goes! It's going! It's gone!" And then closed our eyes and watched it replay in the after-image on our lids. Someone brought a guitar, and as twilight settled in, I propped my feet closer to the fire, hummed along to familiar songs, and smelled the unmistakable, spicy air of the season to come. Like I said at the top of the episode, I am a fall enthusiast. And in general, someone who just enjoys change quite a bit. So I love writing about the moment when one season begins to slip into another. Our first story, which was written way back in season 1 of Nothing Much Happens, is a sort of fantasy of mine. I don't have a garden. The last time I tried to grow tomatoes, the squirrels took one bite out of each one and then threw them ungratefully down onto the driveway. But I'd like to step out of my house and be able to flip the bottom of my shirt hem up to fill with tomatoes. I don't have a clothesline either, but I do know that feeling of coming into the house and feeling the cool breeze move through the windows and being unable to stay off of my bed. I hope you do too. The second story, A Change of Scenery, was written from my own little methods for shifting my mood. Part of my own healing, just as a person who has had some small share of trauma and dysregulation, has been about restoring joy to my life. I spent many years trying to control everything, especially my body and my eating habits, and it left me with this very regimented, tracked existence that had almost no fun or silliness or joy in it. And so now, after years of learning to put those things back into my day-to-day, I find first that my life is better, because remember, you are meant to enjoy your life, but also that joy is easier to find because I have practice with it. I can find it even on difficult days, and I'm really proud of that. So I want to encourage you. Hey, if you're still here listening to me now, then this message is for you. Please let yourself have fun, silly, joyful moments. Buy some popsicles. Take yourself to the movies. When someone says something kind to you, let yourself feel it. I have a mint green Vespa moped that I drive up and down Lake Michigan, and I sing along to Pink Pony Club, and where it's safe, lift my arm into the air and let the breeze cut through me. And yes, people do stare a bit. But it's fun, and I think I'm giving them permission to also have fun. I just find a lot of meaning in fun. Now, the last story, Bonfire. I think this might be the same narrator who we hear from in Beachcomber, which is in episode 25 of this show. I laughed to myself while rereading this story because in Michigan, at least in midsummer, the sun sets so late for me that I barely ever see it. Like to be still out on the beach after sunset, that would be almost 10 o'clock at night here. And I am such a naturally sleepy girl. I am in bed by then. So I just dream about those kind of nights happily from my pillow. Thank you for coming to play with me today in the village of nothing much. I still have so many stories to tell you. Till then, be gentle with yourself.